Hi, I'm Diane McGarry with Drake Arts. With me today are co-host Tom McGarry, author Jacqueline Dembar Greene, and ASL interpreter Shelley. Jackie is the author of more than 40 books for young readers, including picture books, historical novels, mysteries, nonfiction, and the American Girls Rebecca series. With a passion for history, she almost always builds her stories around a pivotal moment from the past, with rich period details. Often her books bring to life a neglected period in Jewish history. She always strives to create an engaging story where readers feel as if they've stepped back into a different era and experienced life at that time. Many of Jackie's books have won national awards. Her most popular titles include the historical novels Out of Many Waters and One Foot Ashore, companion novels set in 1654. The Rebecca Rubin series, set in 1914, and The Leveler, which takes place in Westborough, Massachusetts in 1789, and her newest historic novel, Walk Till You Disappear, set in the Arizona Territory in 1872. Jackie, thank you so much for sharing your writings with us and coming today. I'm so grateful to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here and see you all again. You did give the perfect background to my writing. And I will say that most of my writing starts out with something I've read, usually in a nonfiction book. Or it's also sparked by something that I've been personally interested in and am doing background research just for my own interest. And then suddenly some ideas sparked. And that's where the ideas really come from for the books. I grew up in Connecticut in a family that was Sephardic Jews. My grandparents were born in Greece, but they always said they were Spanish and they didn't speak Greek. And to top it all off, it seemed like whenever I asked a question about the family background, I didn't really get an answer. So the older I got, the more interested I became in Sephardic history, Spanish Jews who lived in Spain and Portugal and were expelled from the countries around 1492. The background for that history, it had been very little known for a long time. It seems like these days there are more people that have at least heard of Sephardic Jews and have some idea about the history of it. But when I was growing up, it seemed nobody really knew about that. And it became something that I felt I needed to know so much more about in order to explain to other people my own background and understand it myself. So I started out looking at lots of nonfiction books about what had happened. And it seemed like as I was reading, different things would sort of spark my imagination. Sometimes it was one sentence. It's all it took was one sentence to just kind of give me an idea. I don't know. Does somebody want to break in here? Are you? I heard Diane for a moment. Did you want to ask a question or break in for a moment?
No, I just know myself. There have been moments when I've been reading something and there's a sentence that I want to go off on that tangent.
That's right. Yeah. And for me, that history background is so important to the story. But there are other things that I bring to a story. And before I come up with any idea for a book, it's the character that has to come to me. And I'm always cognizant of the fact that the character creates the story. It's engaging your reader to feel that they have stepped back in time, that they've kind of entered a time machine and they are part of that history without thinking about it, without feeling like there are details or historical information that is distracting them. Instead, it's all about the main character and the smaller characters, the ones that add color and background to the plot. So one of the first books that I wrote was a picture book called Butchers and Bakers, Rabbis and Kings.
Wow, I love that title.
Yes. It started out when I read that in 1114, in the province of Tudela, Spain, a new king took over and didn't meet with the Jews to promise them safety and security, which had always happened in the past. And they could not seem to get a meeting with the king or send a representative and be recognized. And they actually became very frightened. And so they tried to decide what they could do, and they left the town. Every single Jewish person in the town of Tudela, Spain, left the city. They camped on the outskirts, waiting for the king to realize that they were significant. They were important to the whole community. And as I started reading about different occupations that they had, they filled every role from the royal baker to the royal coin maker. It went on and on. The list was amazing. I found so many occupations that I was writing them down for my own organization, and I put them in alphabetical order, which is, I'm sorry, this is what I do.
Sure, I would do that too.
Well, I'm not alone in that. And as I wrote it all out, it almost sounded like poetry. It was astrologers, astronomers, armor makers, anchor makers, on it went, and it just read beautifully. And so I decided that there was a story there, but it had to be fun and it had to be humorous. It had to give a new perspective on this. And so I told it from the point of view of this new king, who was sure he didn't need anybody. Until he orders his henchmen to order a meal from the royal bakery. But that person has left the city. And on it went. Everything he wanted, he couldn't get. And then by the end, he finally realizes that he needs to meet with them. So that's how I've kind of started my career, working things in without letting the history ever dominate. Now, as each book comes to fruition, I am building on more than just research. I'm always building on personal experiences. And anytime I can, I am traveling or visiting the area where the story takes place. It's a great excuse to travel, believe me. You can really go to a lot of places that way. You say, well, I have to go there. I'm working on this book. So the newest historical novel that I wrote is called Walk Till You Disappear. Let's see if it shows up. Is it backwards for you?
No, it's fine. Thank you.
Good. Okay. So this book is set in Arizona Territory in 1872. And it started out partly because I've been to Arizona many times, and I've always been interested in the state. I had an aunt when I was a little girl. I had an aunt who had moved there with her husband for asthma reasons. They were trying to get away from New England pollen. And over the years, Arizona became just a sort of fantasy of a place. It always sparked my imagination. And the older I got, the more interested I was in Native American history. And I actually did some nonfiction books. One of them was on the tribe called the Tona Otam.
Yes.
And they were originally called Papago, which was a very insulting term, which I didn't know till I did the research. But anyway, the information that I learned about this tribe and how they had to struggle to maintain their identity, talking to people, reading books. I learned a lot about Native Americans who were taken from their families and sent to government schools or mission schools. The goal being to eradicate their culture and their language and their customs and Americanize them. absolutely take out everything that had been part of their native upbringing by keeping them away from their families. And the stories that I read were truly heartbreaking. And I visited lots of locations where these schools were located and seen photographs of the children when they were first taken, and how they changed them. And at one point, it occurred to me that the Native Americans who were subjected to this type of treatment and to the colonization of their lands were fighting to keep their culture, their beliefs alive so that they wouldn't be lost, in the same way that Spanish Jews who were dispersed around the world were also trying to preserve their culture, their beliefs, their practices, even their foods. And many of them came to the New World when the Southwest was first colonized by the Spaniards. Some of them had been taken forcefully by the Inquisition, which continued to operate in Spain for many, many centuries. And they were hiding their religion. They couldn't let the church or any of the people involved with the Catholic Church realize that they were secretly practicing Judaism. And over time, they lost much of what they had known and tried to preserve, but they always tried to pass on something to the next generation. And when I started thinking about this, plus my own experience with the Tono O'odham tribe and Arizona culture, and just taking lots of hikes and spending time in the desert, which is such a beautiful, unbelievably magical place to be, that I realized that if there was a character, if there was a person who had grown up feeling that they were Catholic and then suddenly discovered that they had Jewish heritage, how would that affect the person? And of course, I'm writing for young people. So this book, Walk Till You Disappear, is for kids who are in about 5th to 8th grade. However, I always believe that any book I write should be able to also be read by an adult. Because if an adult doesn't like it, why would a kid like it? Why would you give it to a kid if you didn't think it was a good story? So Walk Till You Disappear became the story of a young man named Miguel Abrano, whose family story he's heard for so many years. He is sick of hearing about how their family was given a land grant by Spain in return for their ancestors' service with the conquistadors.
Wow.
And he thinks he might want to be a priest. He's very, very involved with the Catholic Church. He would like to convert a lot of these Native Americans who really need to understand how important it is. And he's heard lots of terrible rumors about what Jewish people are like. They were called Israelites back then. They weren't called Jewish as much. And in the Southwest, they referred to them always as Israelites. And I decided that a young man finding out about Jewish ancestry just when he was thinking he knew what his life was going to be like would be really traumatic. That's when I knew I had a character and a story. And so in this book, Miguel comes home from school one day, riding home on a horse that he has to borrow because even though they have a horse ranch, his parents tell him he's too young to ride alone. He has to go with his older brothers who are much older and be accompanied at all times because they're always worried about Apaches, raiders who want the horses and will do anything to take the horses. So he goes home one day and there's a German Jewish peddler who has been invited to spend the night at their home or a few days at their home as he's traveling. Because, of course, at that time, there were no hotels.
Mm.
You couldn't check into the local Holiday Inn
Mm.
or whatever is left these days. And he's very frightened of having this man under his roof. He's worried about what his friends will say.
Mm.
He's worried about whether this person may be some kind of demon.
Mm.
He just doesn't know what to think. But as the evening goes on and they have some visitors, his father takes a book out of a drawer, a very old book, and it's written with very strange markings that Miguel has never seen.
Mm.
And he asks the peddler, Jacob Frank, if he can read this. And Jacob Frank points out that this is something he has heard about but never seen. It was a secret code called Ladino,
Mm.
where characters and letters were written in Hebrew,
Mm.
but the words were Spanish.
Mm.
And Jacob Frank says he could read the letters and the words, but his Spanish is very poor still
Mm.
because he's German and he's an immigrant and
Mm.
he doesn't use Spanish very much.
Mm.
But he starts to read, and Miguel discovers that this famous ancestor that they had, who gave them their name, was really Abraham ben, oh, I'm getting this wrong, Abraham ben Avraham.
Mm.
And that their name, Abrano, was made up to hide from the Inquisition.
Oh.
And as he hears this story, he realizes that Friday night when his mother lit candles, that was a Jewish tradition. The special bread that she baked on Friday, which was a braided egg bread, was a Jewish tradition. All these things handed down from this ancestor. He's shocked. His world is upside down.
Mm.
He's embarrassed in front of these other people. And he cannot accept that everybody knew this except him.
Mm.
He runs out of the house. He jumps on a horse that's tied up to a post, and he rides off into the desert where he promptly gets lost. And he finally stops at a stand of cottonwoods where there's an oasis. He needs to let the horse rest. He knows he'll be fine in the daylight. He'll get back. The horse will know its way back.
Mm.
But as he's there, by early dawn, a group of Apache raiders surrounds him, and they capture him.
Mm.
They march him off into the mountains, and Miguel is now in a completely different environment. He eventually escapes from them, and as he's lost on the desert, he is discovered by a young Tona Otam boy who is running away from a mission school.
Mm.
And together they travel across the desert, and they're both trying to get back to their families.
Mm.
And as they travel, they are talking about their culture and what they've lost and what they are trying to regain.
Mm.
And it's a coming of age story for Miguel, who slowly begins to see his heritage in a new way. And that is really what the story is about. I thought I might read a couple pages
Yeah, sure.
from this. This is when Miguel is in the mountains being marched through the Catalina Mountains, the Santa Catalina Mountains, and he's trying to keep up with this band of Indians. Now, they can't really speak to him, and he can't speak to them. He remembers that Jacob Frank, the peddler, who was talking to the local pharmacist, who was a real person, the apothecary, who was also German, had said something about it's so good to hear the language of the old country.
Mm.
Miguel didn't understand that until later. You'll hear that come up. Of the Native Americans, He calls them Apache, but they are highly insulted and they say they are Inde, because Apache was also a rather derogatory name. So it was given to them by their enemies, and it was a very rather dangerous term. So because Miguel can't speak with these people, he finally gives names to a couple of the Native Americans, the Inde, who are marching him through. The leader of the group, who seems to hold a lot of influence, he calls line leader. There's a man who, an Inde, who took his boots from him and marched off and came back without them. He doesn't know why, but he's barefoot. And he calls him bootless warrior. He took his boots, but never wore them. He just disappeared and the boots disappeared. And bootless warrior is very antagonistic to Miguel. And then there's an Inde who he calls Stoneface, who doesn't talk to him, shows no emotions, doesn't give away anything, but he's a little more sympathetic to Miguel. So they are now climbing higher and higher into the mountains. And this is from kind of the middle of the book. It's chapter 7. Days passed, and each one brought new challenges. Now Miguel inched blindly up a rock face, groping for small crevices to use as toe and finger holds. His shoulders cramped with the effort, and he feared that he would drop onto the trail below. He tried not to look up at bootless warrior and his companions who peered over the edge above him, judging his progress. Miguel sensed bootless warrior's withering stare. Below, thorny cactus sprouted from narrow cracks, and stunted bushes twisted toward the light. The desert floor was far below him, and Miguel's head reeled when he realized how high he was as he clung to the rocks. He forced himself to focus on the next place where he might find a grip. Pull, he told himself, forcing himself a few inches higher. His bare chest rubbed against the cold stones, but perspiration beaded on his forehead. Reaching the top only meant more marching, but losing his hold meant certain death. He tightened his fingers. Pull. For the past 3 days, Miguel had followed the mountain trail relentlessly from dawn until nightfall. Today, when the trail ended at the rock face, the warriors in front of him had scaled the sheer cliff as if they were scrambling across a flat spit of sand. Miguel was constantly surprised by their skills. Now he understood why the cavalry had so much trouble tracking down raiders. Each of the warriors in this band could walk swiftly for 10 or 12 hours without slowing. They wound between rocks and through prickly underbrush, following paths that no soldier would ever notice and no horse could travel. It seemed that just when Miguel thought he would collapse without a drink to revive him, the band came to a water hole. One afternoon, they filled their gourds from a steady drip inside a shallow cave. They ate little, but there was always something to staunch their hunger. Besides pieces of dried horse meat, which Miguel refused, the men collected roots and wild onions and still had a supply of cornmeal. Climbing the steep rock wall was just one more proof that bootless warrior and the others were stronger than Miguel and completely at home in the desert or in the mountains. Miguel tried to ignore the fringe of hair that hindered his vision and the pain that coursed through his shoulders. Cautiously, he curled his bare toes into narrow slits in the rock. He slid one hand higher, groping for a thin ledge that might support his weight. His fingers hooked into a shallow indentation, but when he rested his weight upon it, the rock crumbled and he began to slip. Without a word, Stoneface nudged his shoulder against Miguel's rump. Steadied enough to continue, Miguel found another razor-thin crevice to support his fingers. Stoneface continued to climb, supporting Miguel from beneath. As Miguel stretched for one final pull, line leader reached down and yanked him up over the top. Miguel's chest scraped across the jagged outcroppings, and he stifled a cry. The band already thought he was weak. He didn't need to prove it again. Just below, Stoneface and the 4 remaining warriors scaled the rock like sticky-toed lizards. Miguel had barely a moment for one last look at the dizzying height he had climbed before the group pushed on into the mountains. This time, Stoneface did not shove him into line. Instead, he pulled the headband from his head and offered it to Miguel. Was this a reward for climbing the cliff? Miguel would never have made it to the top without help. He took the faded cloth and tied it around his forehead, holding his hair away from his eyes. He was surprised that the wide strip of cloth served a useful purpose. He nodded his thanks, but Stoneface didn't react in any way. He moves along, and he describes how they've continued to go forward, and they usually stop at night. They get to the top. Bootless warrior trotted alongside and shoved the tip of his bow against Miguel's stomach. Boy is soft, he said derisively. Miguel stiffened, determined to prove him wrong. The men emerged into the sunlight. Miguel welcomed the warmth. From the desert floor where his journey had begun to the higher peaks of the mountains, the landscape had completely changed. And I can tell you, I've been lost in that desert. And it's a little scary, and yeah, it changes. The weather changes. Wildflowers sprouted between rocks, grappling for a foothold, just as Miguel had while climbing the rock face. Creosote bushes and brittle bush burst with yellow spring blossoms that nodded and bobbed while bees flitted between them. The silence around Miguel made him feel as if he were slowly disappearing. He longed to talk with someone, just to feel that he was still Miguel. How different it would be to explore these mountains with his brothers and Papa. I've never been so far from home, he thought. Jacob Frank's words echoed in his fuzzy head. How good it is to hear the language of the old country. Now Miguel understood the peddler's feelings. Even if his brothers called him the name he hated, Miguelito, little Miguel, he would welcome the sound. He trudged forward in a daze. He had hours to walk on his cut feet before he could rest for the night. Now I'm skipping a little, and they're at a campsite, and the members of the band are discussing something. So he says, among the Inde, there had been no arguments until tonight. Bootless warrior squatted close to the fire and spoke in an angry growl. When he finished, line leader rose to his full height, settling the horse blanket around his shoulders like a prince's cape. He spoke in an even tone, holding each man in his gaze for a moment. His hands cut the air in a spreading motion, as if smoothing the ripples on a patch of windswept sand. Stoneface spoke in turn, his voice insistent. He gestured toward Bootless warrior. Miguel had an uneasy sense that they were arguing about him. He watched closely, trying to learn what he could from their gestures and their tone. Suddenly, Bootless warrior pulled an arrow from his quiver and stabbed it into the earth. Pinda the Koi, he shouted, curling his upper lip into a sneer. Miguel's body tensed as an uneasy silence settled over the group. He shrank into the shadows, but line leader stepped forward and pulled him into the circle, gripping his arm tightly. The warrior talked and pointed repeatedly at Miguel. The campfire's flames licked at the dead cactus wood and cast a red glow across the faces that glared up at him. Miguel tried to stand tall, but he was seized with fear. What did it all mean? Line leader shouldered his bow and quiver and gave an order to the group in a voice so low, sounded like the growl of a dog about to attack. He kicked a spray of sand across the fire, and the rest of the band immediately gathered their belongings. Stoneface smothered the fire completely and scattered the hot ashes, while another man swept the area with a pine branch, erasing every trace of their footprints. Line leader pointed Miguel back into his place, and they filed away from camp. The argument and the sudden return to the trail seemed a dangerous sign. We've never traveled at night before. Maybe the warriors had not been arguing about him. Perhaps they were simply disagreeing about whether or not to continue walking in the dark. But why did line leader pull me into front of the group? Miguel worried. With a brief flutter of hope, he wondered if a search party had been sighted. Forcing the men to keep moving, was there a chance that he might be rescued? The group walked more slowly in the dark, but still traveled faster than Miguel wished. His feet were swollen and tender from the cuts he had received along the road. He hoped the night air was too cold for rattlesnakes and tarantulas to venture out. He didn't want to tread on one of them in the dark. Bootless warrior stepped behind him, and Miguel felt the warrior's breath hot against his neck. This was the first time Stoneface had been at his back, and Miguel felt a ripple of fear race up his spine. If line leader had overruled Bootless warrior's argument at the campfire, the younger man might be angry. But it wasn't my doing, Miguel thought. Several members of the band seemed to side with Bootless warrior, but clearly line leader had made the decision to move on. Miguel longed for the sound of hoofbeats. He hoped the cavalry had found his trail. He raised his arm to make the sign of the cross as he uttered a silent prayer when he was struck from behind without warning. He cried out as pain pierced his left shoulder and he stumbled to the ground. Bootless warrior stood above him holding a stout branch. Pinda Lakoyi, the warrior shouted. In the weak moonlight, Miguel saw him lift the stick to strike again. No, he yelled. Miguel raised his right arm to protect himself, but the stick crashed against his head. Searing pain coursed through his temple, and Miguel felt a warm trickle of blood seep under his headband and over his eye. Stoneface jumped on Bootless warrior, grappling for control of the stick. Miguel cowered at the edge of the trail as the two men fell to the ground in a fierce struggle. A whipping sound cut the air as a dark shadow swooped overhead, and an owl's cry ripped eerily through the night like a shriek. Too-hoo! Too-hoo! Stoneface and Bootless warrior stopped fighting as if on command, and the rest of the band stood as still as statues. Miguel sensed the fear that ran through them like a finger of lightning that crackles the air before a storm. I've got to escape, he thought, struggling to rise. This is my chance. He pushed himself up with his right arm, and a sickening wave of dizziness washed over him. The warrior seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. Miguel swayed unsteadily, but no one made a move toward him. The ghostly white face of an owl swept down as the men crouched on the path. Its eerie screech faded into the distance, along with the sound of its beating wings. As if released from a spell, the warriors ran off in disarray. Miguel steadied himself and scrambled back down the trail until he was alone. He teetered at the edge of a steep slope, considering how to climb down, when a threatening voice whispered from the darkness. Pinda Lakoyi, it breathed. The voice filled with contempt. Cold fear tightened Miguel's throat and rooted him to the path as Bootless warrior stepped from behind a bush. He swung his club against Miguel's ribs, knocking him backward over the edge of the steep path. Miguel tumbled like a kicked stone, his body striking against jagged rocks, branches, and cactus spines. Unable to stop, he plunged over the last precipice dropping senseless onto the desert floor below.
Wow.
So it's an adventure story, not history.
Yeah.
Like every single word in there is accurate history.
Yeah.
That's an amazing
Everything.
story. How could you stop? Wait, does he still live?
Well, he's the main character, so that's a good hint.
Oh, I know, but you know what I mean. It's like, oh my gosh, all these things to survive, and the image of the owl, right? And the totem of the
Right.
owl.
Yeah.
The owl was a very dangerous symbol from for a lot of Native Americans, and it was thought to be a spirit from the world beyond, the world of death, and it could be an omen of death. And it's one reason why they wouldn't usually travel at night. They could, but they tried not to. And seeing the owl and that whole scene where they're so frozen on the path would be absolutely accurate. In fact, one of the hardest things about writing this book was trying to make sure that no Native American was going to be offended in any way by anything.
Wow.
So there were 2 Native American readers, and one of them was a professor who was part of the Tohono O'odham tribe. And interestingly, there's a scene when the boys, Rushing Cloud is the boy that finds Miguel, the boy that's running away, the young man that's running away from the mission school, and they need to find things to eat on the desert. Rushing Cloud knows everything to do. And at one point, they have a rattlesnake that they're cooking. It's a good scene. It's fun. And I based that on a time we were in Arizona when we went to a restaurant, and my son, who at that time was probably about 12, ordered grilled rattlesnake.
Oh, yes.
I called him on the phone and said, "What? Tell me all about it." So I knew what it would be like.
We used to get pasta that was in the shape of Texas, and on the back.
Oh, really?
Yeah, on the back of the bag, it said how to cook a rattlesnake. Seriously, I'll never forget that.
Yeah, well, they really do it. And the thing was, I had this scene where they share the rattlesnake, and believe it or not, the Tohono O'odham professor, his only criticism in this whole entire book, which was really good, there was only one thing, because I was worried.
I bet I would be too.
Yeah, there were 2 Native American readers, fact readers, so it was a little nerve-wracking till I heard from them. But he said, Tohono O'odham don't eat rattlesnake.
Oh.
Really?
He said, I've tried to find out why, and I actually don't know, but I do know we never eat snake, and rattlesnake in particular. So I had to find something else for Rushing Cloud to eat while Miguel has the rattlesnake meat. So it wasn't a hard fix, but I was a little disappointed because I had them fighting over like eyeing each other over who would get the last piece. And I had to change all that. So that is that book. And then we still have
one little question, if I may.
Yes,
so
please.
Was your other native reader Inde? And did they have any comments?
She was not, and I'm not sure which tribe she was from, but she was also connected to the Tohono O'odham educational system. And anyway, everybody was fine. So, it was a relief. And we made sure to use at least one endorsement so that anybody who wanted to jump on me for writing about Native Americans would, I'd have a little bit of backup there. So it was good. Yeah.
Well, it's always good to check out things that you're unsure of, right? Because you want to represent the cultures properly.
Yeah.
It's very
and this detail that he picked up on about the rattlesnake, I never would have known that.
Yeah.
It wasn't, and he wasn't even sure why. So So I felt like, okay, well, if he doesn't know, it's okay that I didn't know.
Yeah.
And luckily it didn't involve an entire rewrite of the whole book.
Yeah.
But so other books that I've written, and I thought I would mention a little bit. Most people didn't ever really know my name for quite a while. Even people who are friends of mine who knew I had written several books, sometimes they would say to me things like, "So, are you working or are you still writing?" And then I would say,
Oh,
"Well,
God.
writing is my work." And sometimes I'd get kind of a laugh of disbelief, like, "Oh, right, you know." I think most people think that writers sit down at the computer and then the story writes itself.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I think we're going to face that even more now that I'm reading and hearing about these new computer
Oh,
programs
yes.
that compose text.
Mm,
It's really worrisome.
yeah.
Yeah, they're also making art. They've gleaned art over the whole world, and then they're just producing it, and they haven't actually asked about rights. I mean, some artwork is in public domain,
Oh,
but a lot of current artworks
Mm.
aren't. And they're just taking it all and regurgitating it with an image that a person, I don't want to call them an artist, a person thinks of, because to me, being an artist is taking all that from the outside, putting it inside yourself, and then giving it back out. There's the process of the breathing in on the work and then the breathing out, which you talked about.
right,
But
right.
computers don't breathe in and breathe out. They're not, people always think of them as intelligent, right? They're not intelligent. They are
Right,
machines. They don't
right,
have, they're not sentient beings.
right. Well, yeah, I feel like when I'm writing, the main thing that gives life to my characters is me sharing a feeling, a thought, something I remember experiencing, and pulling on that emotion
Sure.
to impose that on my character because I know it's real and I know that it's something that a young person can relate to, as well as just the idea of pulling out comparisons, similes, and description of something that I may personally have seen or touched,
Mm.
felt, sensed, so that I can bring in the senses. And I think you could tell from the passage that I read that I try to make that physical presence real in the book. I want the reader to feel what the character is physically feeling, as well as what they're thinking. And
You're very
it's
good at that, Jackie. It comes through,
thank
right?
you. Thank you.
I mean, you're a wonderful
That's good
writer
to
because
know.
you just engage people in, you create the world entirely around them, which a
Oh,
lot of
that's
times
lovely.
people leave out some of the senses, but you don't. You complete the picture, which is a
Yeah,
gift, and I really appreciate it.
In the
thank
past,
you. I try to include smells, and I find that one of the hardest things to describe. Taste and smell. Taste is one thing, but smell is really difficult to
Yeah.
describe. And I find that usually when I'm doing that, I'm having to compare it to something to try to give my reader some connection to make with that description. Smell is really hard when you think about it.
Yeah.
in the passage you read where Miguel is climbing up the cliff and
Yeah,
grasping for the tiny cracks. And then later you talk about the wildflowers that are also grasping for
yeah,
the tiny cracks. That really got me
yeah.
because somehow I could feel both at the same time. That was really cool. But that's
Oh,
not the
that's
smell.
great. Yeah. Well, the rattlesnake cooking
Uh,
smell and touch and
Oh, yeah.
bones and everything.
uh,
Yeah. That's neat.
That was the main thing that my son remembered from eating it, that he didn't realize that a snake is all bones and muscle. It's bones and muscle.
mm.
And his first bite, he bit in and it was all bones. And I put that in the story because I thought that was
Oh
just
yeah.
so tactile.
Mm.
You
Wow,
know?
definitely. And it's not something we would expect unless we'd experienced it.
No, no, I didn't taste that rattlesnake. I thought if that's what you want, I'm sticking with chicken. So the one thing that kind of gave me the biggest national boost was writing for American Girl.
Mm.
And that was a very interesting project where editors there had read some of my other books, Out of Many Waters and One Foot Ashore. And there are female characters in there, a 12-year-old and a 16-year-old, two sisters. And it's historical novels set in 1654.
Mm-hmm.
And because of those books, they decided that I might be someone who could create a Jewish background character and recreate or create stories about a Jewish character. But their caveat was that it had to be mostly about immigration, set sometime between 1880 and 1914, before World War I.
Oh, wow.
And they didn't care what country the family came from. They didn't care what year it was in that time frame. They didn't care how I set up the family structure or anything else, as long as someone who was Jewish could relate to the books and someone who was not Jewish wouldn't feel that this was a Jewish story for Jewish readers.
Oh,
And immigration to the US had to constantly be at the forefront. So this was another challenge and a different kind of writing completely, because I had to fit in with a framework of how American Girl structures their characters, their historical characters. So it used to be that each character had 6 books following 1 year in the life of the main character. So my character, I named Rebecca Rubin. Her grandparents and parents immigrated from Russia. Originally, I wanted to make them Sephardic. I'm sorry, I'm stuck on that.
no, it's
But
not something people don't know enough about.
that's right. And I wanted to set it in Boston because I knew a lot about the neighborhoods and the Old West End, and also in the North End, where Jewish families settled when they first came to America. And a lot of ships were rerouted from Ellis Island. When Ellis Island was overcrowded, they sent them to Boston.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, a lot of immigrants who thought they were going to be in New York City ended up in Boston.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was going to do that, but then as I did my research, it turned out that the largest, most significant wave of immigrants came from Russia, especially for Jewish families. And they mostly all settled on the Lower East Side in New York, about which I knew bupkis, nothing. And so, being of Sephardic background, I had to turn to my father, whose Russian background I knew very little about, and talk to him and relatives. My mother-in-law, whose family had come from White Russia, talked to them about a lot of things. Sought out every person I could find that I knew who was over 90, who had any recollection of growing up in New York, in that area. American Girl brought me on a fabulous week trip to New York City, where we walked every street, went to every museum, saw tenements, went to parks. I actually found the school that I was going to use for Rebecca's elementary school, which is still there
Mhm.
after so many, many, many decades.
Wow.
And it is a community center.
Mhm.
And they were so excited that the school was going to be in a book
Oh.
that they gave us a fabulous tour
Mhm.
and showed us old photos of the school and brought us up on the roof where that was the kids' playground, was the roof of the
Oh.
building.
Huh.
That makes
And we
sense in
got
the
to-
city.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in this book, this is the second book in the Rebecca Rubin series.
Huh.
And now they're kind of not anthologized, but they're condensed into 2 volumes instead of 6 separate books.
Hmm.
But this is the original. I love the originals with the gorgeous illustrations.
Hmm.
And when we did the trip, the illustrator was with us and the editor and the art editor. It was fabulous. It was really exciting. And in this book, Rebecca's family, her grandparents have come from Russia, and her father's brother is the last family member that they have not been able to bring over yet.
Oh, wow.
And the Russians are beginning to take children as young boys as young as 12 and pulling them into the Russian army.
Ooh.
And they don't get any training. It sounds a little frighteningly like things going on today, although not at 12 years old.
Mm.
And the family in America is trying desperately to save to bring them over before it's too late.
Mm.
And Rebecca is, in the first book, is trying very hard to help raise money so they can save for this. And in this book, her family has come, the new family has come, and she has a cousin who is exactly her age.
Mm.
And they look very much alike with the same copper-colored hair. And she's going to take her to school with her. Now, Rebecca has 2 older sisters who are twins, Sadie and Sophie.
Mm.
And she always feels left out because they have each other. They're
Mm.
like this.
Mm.
And Rebecca is the odd man out, even in their sleeping area. So they have a bedroom with 2 beds. The twins sleep in one bed and Rebecca sleeps in the other bed, and she's always left out.
Mm.
But now she's got her cousin, Anna, and she's bringing her to school for the first day. Anna has just arrived with her family the day before.
Mm.
They came on a Sunday, and on Monday, she's going to school.
Wow.
And this is actually what happened to people.
Mm.
And they were just left to basically fend for themselves. So if I can quickly, in maybe 5 minutes, just give a little taste
Mm.
of how it would be. And I wanted my readers to see this from a kid's point of view. And I wanted it to be the American child, the American young lady, who is thinking that she is going to help settle this new immigrant until she discovers it's not so easy.
Yeah.
So they are at school on the first day. The teacher has agreed to let Anna come into the classroom with Rebecca and seated them next to each other. And every single thing in the opening of this scene is based on tons of research about what the schools were like. Separate entrances for girls and boys, separate coat rooms, getting your hands checked for cleanliness, making sure you had a white handkerchief.
Mm.
And they come into the classroom, and I'm trying to skip to a spot that I can do it a little bit shorter so I don't spend too much time on it. Anna confronts the teacher, who isn't so sure she wants to let her into the classroom. She said, and so this is how she speaks to the teacher. "I speak English," Anna declared. She cleared her throat. "My name is Anna Rubin. I have 9 years. I can write English alphabet." Miss Maloney crossed her arms and tapped her finger thoughtfully. Then she turned to Mama and said, We'll try it for a few days, but if it doesn't work out, she'll have to go into a much lower grade or the special class. She looked at Rebecca. Help your cousin learn the routine, but I want no unnecessary talking, and you must speak only in English. Otherwise, Anna will never learn. So Rebecca promises, and they sit down, and the teacher starts off doing a little math quiz kind of a thing. So, class, she began, and the students sat up straight with their hands folded on their desk. Since it's Monday morning, and your minds have probably been quite idle during the weekend, we shall begin with some arithmetic teasers. Leo Berg, you are class monitor this week. Leo walked around importantly and handed out blank paper at the beginning of each row of desks. When he reached Anna's row, he smirked at her. Greenie, he said under his breath. Anna didn't understand what Leo had said and didn't know it was an insult. She gave him a friendly smile. Rebecca fumed. Leo could be so nasty. Anna leaned over and whispered, "What is teaser?" Rebecca tried to explain quietly. Miss Maloney gives us numbers to add and subtract. She does it out loud, very fast. We have to do the problem in our heads and just write down the answer. Anna looked puzzled. Miss Maloney began the exercise, speaking rapidly. 3 plus 5 minus 2 plus 6 minus 7. The students all wrote down their answers except for Anna. She tapped Rebecca's arm as Miss Maloney launched into the next problem. Rebecca tried to ignore her cousin and concentrate, but by the time Miss Maloney had gotten halfway through the new problem, Rebecca was impossibly lost. She had to leave the answer blank. Just add and subtract each number in your head, she explained again, but Anna still didn't understand. Maybe she didn't know the meaning of the words add and subtract, Rebecca thought. There was only one way to make it clear. Covering her mouth and whispering softly, Rebecca began to explain the exercise in Yiddish. She hadn't spoken more than 3 words when Miss Maloney slapped her ruler against the desk. Rebecca was so startled she nearly jumped out of her shoes. "Rebecca Rubin," Miss Maloney said, "come up here immediately." Rebecca approached the teacher's large oak desk. I only needed to give her the directions, but Miss Maloney wouldn't listen. "You know the rules," she said. "There is no place in this school for any language except English." She took the dunce cap from the shelf and plopped it on Rebecca's head. Rebecca walked slowly to the tall stool in the corner of the room in front of everyone. Her face burned with shame. Leo snickered, and his friends joined in, and soon the entire class was laughing at her. When Rebecca dared to look up, she saw Anna giggling and pointing at the dunce cap. Her heart sank. Even her cousin was making fun of her. It was the worst punishment Rebecca could imagine. So this goes on a little bit, and they go out for lunch, and Leo walks by as they're sitting outside having lunch and says, "Greenie, Greenie," taunted Leo and his friends as they passed by. "Yiddish talking Greenie." Rebecca jumped up and yelled back, "Meanie, meanie, big fat weenie." A weenie was a German sausage, and that seemed like a good name for Leo. Rose pulled her down. "Ignore them," she said. "You'll only get into more trouble. How many mistakes do you want to make today?" Rebecca turned her back on the boys. "Even Anna laughed at me," she muttered to Rose. "And I spoke Yiddish to help her." Anna saw the others laughing and thought it must be a joke, Rose explained. "She doesn't know what a dunce cap is." "What Anna not know?" Rebecca's cousin asked. "The pointy hat Miss Maloney put on Rebecca is called a dunce cap," Rose told her. "Dunce means stupid. It's a punishment for breaking the rules. Rebecca broke the rules by speaking Yiddish in school." Anna turned pale. "I not know," she protested. "I am sorry, Rebecca. Don't be mad on me."
That's great. That's great. I hate to do this now, but we're going to have to
Yep.
stop. But it's been so wonderful, Jackie. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. It's
fascinating.
just
Thank you
great.
so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm glad it all
Welcome.
worked out.
Yes. And we'd like to thank our many sponsors: Amy Lamb, Shelley Payson, Robin Rubendunst, Susan Belkin, Helen Fremont, Carol Scott, Philip Thibault, Lois Welber, Anita Banglanes, Marianne Donice Goldman, Galina Sokes, and the Concord, Dracut, North Reading, Westford, and Wilmington Cultural Councils for granting us Massachusetts Cultural Council funds, and Anonymous and Diane Song. Thank you so much for all of you being here. If you're interested in finding out more about Dracut Arts, go to dracutarts.com or visit our YouTube channel. We do have one of those now. For more information, you can also email us, dracutarts@gmail.com. Thank you.